I'd like to officially get things underway by introducing our first speaker, Christopher Gwynne. Chris is the Project Director for Hydro Tasmania's Battery of the Nation project, a role which sees him managing the strategic development of the Battery of the Nation initiative, which is effectively the blueprint for how Hydro Tasmania's renewable energy resources could be developed over the coming decades. An electrical engineer by profession, Christopher has spent the last 15 years working across the full spectrum of Hydro Tasmania's activities, from consulting on electrical transmission, refurbishments, to overseeing commercial operations and transactions, such as the transfer of Aurora's gas operations to Hydro Tasmania in 2013. Today, Chris will be giving us an update on how the Battery of the Nation initiative is progressing to date, and he'll go into further detail on why deep storage, like what we'll be seeing through the Battery of the Nation project, is so important to our electricity market going forward. So for now, that's it from me. I will hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Laura. Firstly, thanks for inviting me along today. It's pretty exciting to do a virtual webinar to possibly 700 odd people. So it's a bit of a first for me. So, and all from my bedroom in sunny Richmond down here in Tasmania. So, look, I hope I can set the tone for the afternoon for everyone listening in terms of providing something that's interesting and stimulating. And I'll also make sure that I'll to leave as much time as I can for questions at the back end of my presentation. There's sort of two messages that I want to get across today. I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, this idea of deep storage, and it's not some sort of weird Hollywood movie. It's a term that's starting to get a lot more traction in terms of the future of the national electricity market. And then I'd sort of like to relate that to the deep storage opportunities that exist in Tasmania. And it's not just about pumped hydro development in Tasmania. You can really look at our whole existing hydropower system, and it essentially is one big deep storage asset that, with more interconnection to the mainland, could provide a really important, I guess, set of services into the market as we transition over the coming decades. So let's get into it. Yeah, and I'm sure most of the viewers or attendees today have seen versions of this graphic. So really, it looks at how I guess we're expecting our existing coal-fired fleet to retire from the market over the next 30 years.
One of the really interesting things about this slide isn't so much that this retirement schedule is going to occur. It's just that we don't know exactly when these generators are going to retire because it is a market context. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this schedule, and when one of these assets does leave the market, as we saw with Hazelwood, it can cause quite a lot of disruption. So from a planning perspective, it's really important that we actually think carefully about the range of scenarios that we're dealing with, and we really need solutions in place before we think we're needed. There's no such thing as a just-in-time model really when you're talking about a transition of this size. The second thing to note here is that this generation, as most people now are aware, will largely be replaced by wind and solar generation, and solar generation being utility scale solar, but also behind the meter. And we all know now that as we get further and further into this transition, and we have a energy supply mix in Australia that becomes more dominated by wind and solar, we're going to have this variability in when the energy comes into the system, and that's when the storage conversation kicks in. So it's pretty well recognised now in the market that we are going to need quite a lot of storage in the system to make it both secure and reliable. And we'll get to the difference between those two terms a little bit later when we talk about storage and the role it needs to play, because that's when you really start to have a closer look at the idea that there's different sorts of storage that will be required, and we'll call it shallow and deep storage, and we'll talk a bit about the roles that we think they'll play. Now, it's really a good point at this stage to point out that as we go through this transition, there's a lot of conversation in the market now around transmission and interconnection investment. And, you know, this transition where we're going from a very centralised form of generation to a very decentralised one, and we're getting all these new storage assets that we think we're going to have to come into the market as well, it's no surprise that the transmission system that holds all this together is a really important part of the conversation. And certainly if anyone's involved in the industry day to day, a day doesn't go by when there's not some sort of discussion on how do we manage this element of the transition. because we can say the resource is there, but we've got to make sure that we can economically connect those resources into the market of the future. And look, when we talk about storage, it's also part of that conversation. So when we look at some of the big transmission and interconnection projects that are up there at the moment, HumeLink, Kerang is now called Vic West, and then Marinus Link is the interconnector that's being assessed into Tasmania as well. So these are the sorts of investments that we're going to need to make, as well as the investment in the new generation and the new storage, if we want the system of the future to be not only low emissions and affordable, but it also needs to be secure and reliable as well. And I guess this is this graphic is really designed to show you two of the major sort of pumped hydro projects that are on the go at the moment, Snowy 2 and the Battery of the Nation. And you can see that the development of these projects is very closely intertwined with the development process for major interconnectors as well. It should be noted that from a market perspective, it's expected that then there will need to be significant investment in interconnection across the market to make this new system work. And whilst obviously, I'll be focused on the Tasmanian part of that story and what Tasmania can contribute to that transition, certainly the story around Marinus Link is not occurring in isolation. There's a number of interconnector projects that are under assessment across the market at the moment. Today, I'll be mainly focusing on what's on the other end of the interconnector, because I work for Hydro Tasmania, and I guess that's my area of expertise. But obviously, you can't have a conversation about the storage opportunities in Tasmania without sort of covering off that issue of interconnection. But yeah, let's get to the bit about storage. So I think when we first started on this journey in the market, the storage was just storage. If I wind the clock back to 2016, 2017, at that time, certainly when I started on this project in Hydro Tasmania, there wasn't a lot of nuancing in the discussion around what sort of storage was required. But I think we've come a long way as a market over the past couple of years. And there was an insights paper that AEMO released last year that really started to talk about this concept that I've got on this slide. And that is that there's this idea of shallow storage and the role that it will need to play in the market of the future, and this role of deep storage. And it's really around, the terms really denote, I guess, the storage duration of the assets as they come into the market. Now, an easy way to understand what it is that they're getting at is that there's been a lot of work internationally on the levels of, I guess, renewables penetration into systems. So when you're at the start of a transition, so which most systems are globally, and we're no different, when you have relatively low levels of variable renewable energy come into your system, and that's what wind and solar is, you tend to have these, the needs that show up first are the ones where you have the short variations in load or supply, contingency events that are caused by supply and demand imbalances, these sorts of things that occur pretty much in the shorter time frame, sort of in the less to 4 hours. And you're starting to see those things occur in Australia now. So as the penetration of wind and solar builds slowly, this is the area where you see storage technology starting to come in first. And that is why you're seeing a lot of battery technology starting to come into the market, because battery technology is perfect for this role in the market. It's fast response, it's very easy to deploy, you can distribute it throughout the network where it's needed. And essentially, it's really the technology of choice that you're going to see come into the market and take up this space, which the market's starting to refer to as shallow storage. And the market's doing that already. It's not just the Honsdale battery in South Australia, but you're starting to see a lot of other batteries quickly moving through their planning phases, because this is the space that they're operating in at the moment. The trick is, if you wind the clock forward, say 5 to 10 years, and we're a lot further into this transition, and we've lost another couple of coal-fired generators, it's probably the easiest way to look at it, and you're getting much higher levels of penetration of wind and solar, you're starting to get another requirement coming when it comes to storage, and this is what they call deep storage. So, you know, we talk about daily balancing of solar cycles. We're talking about the impacts of large cloud bands in a system that are heavily reliant on solar. And interestingly, you see the same thing with bushfires as well. So AEMO saw the same thing, same impacts from bushfire smoke, in January, in terms of the impact it has on systems that are becoming more reliant on solar. And you go out that next step, and when you can get successive days of minimal wind generation. So basically, this basically creates, in a sense, holes in the system in terms of provision of energy that are much larger than what you would call shallow storage in that realm of battery technology, which could even go up to 6 to 8, even to 10 hours. We're really talking about much longer durations of storage that will be needed. And that's really where you'll be looking to your existing hydropower systems in your network, and that's, you know, particularly Snowy Hydro and Hydro Tasmania are the two main players there. But you're also going to be looking at pumped hydro installations, particularly the ones that have longer storage durations. So, you know, to give everyone an example, the Snowy 2 obviously is about 157 hours, so it's right at one end. It's sort of an anomaly in terms of storage duration. And I'll show you later in this pack the projects that we're looking at in Tasmania for pumped hydro development are all in the sort of 14 to 30 hour bracket, and we think that's actually the sweet spot for pumped hydro over the next 10 to 20 years in Australia. Because it's that level of storage that will be very difficult for batteries to economically hit because of the size of the storage requirements. And if you don't have enough storage in your system, well, the only way to actually fill these holes is through gas-fired generation or something like that. So it's a really important part of the conversation when we talk about storage. And, you know, I often get the question, aren't batteries going to do all the storage that we need in the future? And this slide really shows you that we're actually going to need a number of different technologies playing their part as we go through this transition. We'll clearly need batteries to come into the market in a big way, but we're also going to need what I would call deep storage pumped hydro sites to come into the system as well. And we'll have a look at some of those in Tasmania in a little while. Really important question in the market is how much storage do we need? And it's hard to model because you're really trying to model the future. But what we've tried to do at Hydro, well, I mean, we've been managing hydropower storages for a very long time. So it's something that we've taken an interest in for lots of different reasons over the years. What we do know is that most of the modeling that is done for storage in the future market relies on this idea called perfect foresight. And that's the idea that you can actually predict the future in terms of knowing when the best prices are going to be to charge and discharge a storage asset. But in reality, you obviously can't tell the future. You know, every single decision you make as the owner of a storage asset in terms of charging or discharging your asset, you're actually making a decision around whether or not that is the best time to charge or discharge. So for example, if the price is low, I'll just use low as a qualitative sense, and you choose to charge your battery or your pumped hydro installation, what you're basically doing is potentially missing out an opportunity to charge at a lower price at some stage in the future. And there's the same thing that occurs when you're discharging. So if you have a view that there's a high price and you choose to discharge your storage technology or your storage asset, you're making a decision that you're basically foregoing a future opportunity where there might have been a higher price. So really, there's perfect foresight doesn't really exist in the future market. There's a big difference though in terms of the efficiency of these assets, in terms of how well you can manage that impact of lack of foresight. And the analysis that we've done shows you that deep storages are much better at managing those uncertainties in the market because you have bigger storages to play with. And it's sort of instinctively, it sort of makes sense, because if you've got a really short storage, you've really got to make a snap decision and operate that storage. Whereas if you have a longer duration storage, you can make those smaller decisions, but they don't really rule out every other possible opportunity that comes into the future. And we've done some work over the past couple of years that actually shows that is the actual case when you look at real modelling and compare it against perfect foresight modeling. And basically what it shows you is that deep storage assets are far more efficient in their dispatch. So basically, you can get up to a 90% efficiency in dispatch of the megawatts that you've got for deep storages. So storage is over sort of 12 to 14 hours of duration. Whereas the efficiency drops off very, very quickly. And if you're down around 2 or 3 hours of storage duration, the efficiency drops right down to sort of 10 or 20%. Now, as the owner of a single asset, that's okay because you can make financial decisions, but it has a big impact on how much storage you think you're going to need overall. So what that means is, quite simply, at a system level, the system will be more efficient if more deep storage is built. And that's basically because it'll be able to run more efficiently at a system level. Therefore, in terms of the overall storage requirements of the system, you won't need as much as if you just built shallow storage. So from a system efficiency perspective, if there are deep storage sites, particularly pumped hydro sites in Australia, we really need to be looking closely at how we bring those to the market. And so far, you're seeing that there's actually not a lot of deep storage sites that are there to be developed. So it's no great surprise that both Snowy Hydro and Hydro Tasmania are really the focus areas for these deep storage assets. So for Tasmania, it goes a little bit like this in terms of what the opportunity is. So you can essentially look at our current hydro system as one big deep storage asset. At the moment, we predominantly use it to keep the lights on in Tasmania. But interestingly, we actually have excess capacity already in our system. So we have around 2,400 megawatts of existing hydropower in Tasmania. And the load in Tasmania at its highest, which is on a cold winter morning, is around 1,800 megawatts. And normally it sits around 12 or 1,300 megawatts. And particularly in the summer, when you have a lot of stress in the Victorian system in particular, we often have a lot of latent capacity in our system. So essentially, if you can look at case studies where there's been a Victorian system under stress and we've got excess capacity, and we'll be filling up the existing link, which is Basslink, and that's about 500 megawatts. But we'll still have in excess of 400 megawatts, sometimes even up over 600 megawatts of unused hydro capacity sitting in Tasmania that you can't turn on because there is no way to get it to the market that needs it on the mainland. Now, it's a question of capacity, not energy, because you're really looking at trying to utilize these assets over relatively short time periods, 4 to 6 or to 8 hours. And because our hydro system is built for energy, in terms of, we're used to trying to keep the lights on in Tasmania all the time, operating that extra capacity over those shorter time periods doesn't have a big impact on our energy storages, but it has a massive impact on the system in Victoria when it's under stress. On top of that, we've got lots of opportunity to build deep storage pumped hydro sites. So this is linking back to the deep storage conversation. We've got a topography that lends itself to really cost-efficient pumped hydro development. We can utilize the existing hydropower assets we have and augment them for pumped hydro development. And we've got the existing transmission network as well that already goes to these hydropower sites that we can augment to take it to be able to handle pumped hydro development. So pumped hydro development in Tasmania is really around, we've got the water. Pumped hydro investment would allow us to use that water more flexibly, and it would also allow us to build more megawatts in our system. And we'll have a look at, if you think about a 2,400 megawatt system we've got at the moment, and a pumped hydro site at the moment we're looking is around 750 megawatts. So basically that would allow us to increase the size of our capacity down here in Tasmania, and also utilize our existing storages more efficiently to be able to provide these new storage services into the market as we transition away from coal over the next couple of decades. So essentially that is the idea around battery of the nation. And it really comes off the back of this idea that as we get more and more wind and solar coming into the system, the assets that will become really valuable will be those that we can dispatch and control, which is what hydropower does, and assets that you can store energy. And essentially that's describing really what a hydropower system is all about. Okay, let's have a look at some of the pumped hydro sites we're studying at the moment in Tasmania. So it's important to note here about how the development process would align with interconnection. So I'll loop back to the interconnection story. Essentially, Marinus Link is the current assessment for more interconnection between Tasmania and Victoria, and they're assessing two new cables. So at the moment we have one 500 megawatt cable between the two states, and Marinus Link is looking at bringing another 750 megawatt cable in, sort of in the mid to late 2020s, and then another one after that. So with that first new Marinus Link cable, we don't need to build a pumped hydro site in Tasmania because we have that latent capacity that we spoke about in an earlier slide. So a much better investment of our capital is to actually invest in the current system and get it ready to take advantage of that new interconnector, because we have the existing capacity in the system, and we can augment the system to get another couple of 100 megawatts out of the existing system without having to build a pumped hydro site. The pumped hydro site opportunity comes along with the next Marinus Link cable. So the second Marinus Link cable, that's where we sort of max out that natural latent capacity that we have in this current system. And that's where we'd be looking to build anything up to sort of 750 or an 800 megawatt pumped hydro site in Tasmania. And we're really targeting that storage duration of somewhere between 14 and 30 hours. And essentially, if we wind right back to the start of my presentation, that's the sweet spot we think for pumped hydro in the future for the market, because that's where that deep storage requirement will kick in. And we think it'll start to kick in quite strongly from the mid to late 2020s onwards. So we're looking at 3 sites at the moment. We're blessed with sites to look at. We only need to develop one of these sites. We've actually got probably 6 or 7 different sites that we've sort of looked at, but we've put on the shelf, as we think the best one to go first will be one of these 3. Lake Rowallan and Sathana, their existing storage is on the northwest in the existing Mersey Forth scheme. Those 2 sites need an upper storage built, and you can imagine the upper storage is much, much smaller than the existing lower storages, because the lower storages are built for energy, so they're very large. The Lake Plimsoll or Tribute site is on the west coast in our current west coast scheme, and it essentially is a pumped hydro site in parallel to an existing hydropower station, which is called Tribute. So we would use 2 existing reservoirs, and we would link them with a pumped hydro installation, which would be in parallel with an existing hydropower station. And each of these sites would be around 750 megawatts. We're sort of looking at what's the best sizing for it at the moment. So we expect by the end of this year sometime, we'll make a call on which of these 3 sites we would take forward to line up with that second Marinus cable. And the timing is really important, because we expect the second half of this year we'll also get a much firmer view on the decision around Marinus Link, and particularly the timing of the 2 cables, because obviously we need to line up our pumped hydro site to line up with that second cable. Now, I'll quickly sort of change tact a little bit here, because one of the questions that we do always get, and that question is, how can this sort of development be cheaper at a system level in Tasmania when you've got to build this big interconnector? Because a 1500 megawatt interconnector, which is the 2 Marinus Link cables, is over $3 billion in terms of an infrastructure investment. So we get this question all the time. So we've done a lot of work to understand what that value, I guess, stack looks like in terms of a technology mix. So these 2 slides talk about the proposition, or the hypothesis rather, is if you had to actually supply 750 megawatts of new shaped energy into Melbourne, so not just wind and solar, but actual controlled shaped energy into Melbourne, which is essentially what you would get from Marinus. And these are the sorts of sizes of requirements you're going to see as coal-fired generators retire. If you needed that, just how much would it cost to be able to bring that sort of, from the cost of the delivered energy, what would it cost to be able to bring that in? So, and we've got a number of different Victorian options. You can see the top 4 options are Victorian only options, and they range from up the top being gas fired, doing it all with gas at a $12 per gigajoule cost. And then you've got a mix of, wind and solar and battery storage, wind and solar and pumped hydro and battery. There's a whole mixture of different other, I guess, technologies that are blended together. And these are all using EMO assumptions, the assumptions that EMO were using in the draft ISP they put out last year. And the bottom 2 are the 2 Tasmanian options. And So you can see here, importantly, it includes transmission. So that last green slot is the Marinus Link interconnector for the Tasmanian options. So importantly, you can see here that even when you take into account the cost of the interconnection, you're still getting a far more cost competitive proposition coming out of Tasmania. And it's because of the natural advantages you have with the existing hydropower system. And that's really that lowest, that's that smallest one, second from the bottom. And the efficiency you get by bringing in more diverse ranges of new energy into the system, particularly the wind energy from Tasmania, and that blending with the wind and solar development that occurs in Victoria. So this really answers the question that even with the cost of interconnection, if you look at the total delivered cost of that energy, the Tasmanian options are some of the best you're going to see in the market of the future. But we got a bit aggressive because we saw the bottom fall out of the gas market recently. So we said, let's take a different view. Let's actually be really aggressive on battery storage technology costs. So we halved those, and then we also decreased the costs of Victorian pumped hydro, and we halved the gas cost down to $6 a gigajoule. And you can still see that even with those aggressive assumptions, and we didn't change the Tasmanian assumptions, and even with those changes, you can still see that the Tasmanian options, particularly that first cable, is still 15% better than anything else that's going to be going around. When you get to the point where you need that level of new energy, new firmed energy coming into the system. But yeah, I think this is my last slide, so I've timed it pretty well. So look, it's a bit of a summary slide. So, you know, hopefully you've got a little bit of a snapshot today from and got a bit of a better understanding around this idea of deep storage and why it's important. And if you're really trying to find the least cost solution for customers, you know, if we find deep storage sites, pumped hydro sites in the market, we do need to work out how do we bring them to market, because they will help us get to that lowest cost solution for customers in the long run. Another interesting aspect of this development, which I didn't touch on too much today, is that one of the things that occurs if you build a Marinus Link is that you don't only stimulate a lot of new wind development in Tasmania, because at the moment Tasmania's got a great wind resource, but you can't build much of it because you don't have a big enough market in Tasmania to be able to build a business case off the back of it. So not only would Marinus Link trigger a lot of new wind development in Tasmania, but interestingly, it would also stimulate a lot of new solar development in Victoria as well, because if you don't have access to storage, you'll very quickly hit an economic limit in terms of your solar build. And if you can access that competitive deep storage, which is what Tasmania can offer, you actually can open up a lot more renewable energy development in Victoria as well as Tasmania, and the Marinus Link business case is showing that to be the case. Another point which I didn't spend too much time on today is that Marinus Link also, by bringing more Tasmanian hydropower assets into the Victorian market, will actually increase competition in dispatchable capacity in Victoria. And that'll have a big impact on prices for customers as well. So there's a lot of value tied up in the Victorian market at the capacity end of the curve. And anything you can do to bring more competition into the market will actually create a lot more downward pressure on Victorian prices. And that's really where you'll feel a lot of the impact of these changes. Marinus Link at the moment, the modelling they've done has shown that investing in that sort of interconnection and bringing those assets from Tasmania closer to Victoria, figuratively speaking, does create a lot of downward pressure on prices, not just in Victoria, but across the NEM more broadly, when you start to take into account all that other interconnection that's under investigation at the moment. So I'll stop there because it'll give us 10 minutes for questions. I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. So that's a picture of Lake Plimsoll on the west coast. So it's a beautiful place if you've never been there, and that is a hydro lake, and it's already got a hydropower station on it, and it would effectively be the reservoir of the upper reservoir of a new pumped hydro station if we were to build one on the west coast.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Full of insights, chock full of information as always. We really appreciate you sharing that with us today. Unsurprisingly, I do have a few questions that have come through, so we'll start to go through those. First one was just a quick query around what the current and projected power demand of Tasmania, as I say, what is it currently and what is it projected to be in the years to come? And then beyond there, what is the actual potential of hydropower development in Tassie? So what would be I guess the gap that could potentially be exported into other states?
Yeah, okay. I'll probably start with the Tasmanian government just released about a month ago, Tasmanian renewable energy targets. So they're looking to increase the renewable energy output of the energy system in Tasmania by doubling it. So at the moment we have, look, it's demand wise, it sort of ranges anywhere between 1,000 and 1,800 megawatts in terms of a demand load. In terms of gigawatt hours, you're sort of looking at around sort of 9,000 gigawatt hours or 9 terawatt hours of load. A large chunk of that is locked up in 4 major customers in Tasmania. So we have 4 very large industrial customers that make up about 60% of that. So there's some big variables in there in terms of energy balance for Tasmania. I guess some of the important things to note is that increased interconnection between the 2 states actually would enable a number of different things to change, not just in Victoria but in Tasmania. You would get quite a lot of new wind investment in Tasmania because the wind resource is really high quality in Tasmania, and it's also it's got a lower correlation with Victorian and South Australian wind, so economically it's got a lot of value. But you'll also see when you have that greater integration between the Victorian and Tasmanian markets, you'll also see an impact from the load side as well. And part of that story is also the hydrogen story. So there's a big opportunity for hydrogen industry development in Tasmania. If you can imagine, if you've got a really, really high quality wind resource and you've got a big hydropower system that can firm and balance the ebbs and the flows of new variable renewable energy, it allows you to actually design a hydrogen industry in Tasmania with a very high capacity factor. So look, there's lots of opportunities for Tasmania over the coming decades to if you can sort of unlock this larger energy system, and that's effectively what a Marinus Link will allow you to do. Mm-hmm. There's some really big opportunities, not just in terms of energy generation, but also load in Tasmania.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Chris. It's not just about, what the potential of the system in Tasmania is now. It's about what some of this investment would potentially unlock and create down the track. I have another question here, and this relates to, I think, one of your slides about halfway through the presentation. Yep. Is the 250 megawatts related to 30% non-availability of coal? And is it separate, or is it separate demand in Victoria?
Is the 250 megawatts related to 30%?
Related to 250 megawatt related to 30% non-availability of coal, or is it separate demand in Victoria?
I don't remember where the 30% number came from. I
think it was about halfway through, Chris. I remember seeing the question come up and I was kind of looking at the slide and I thought, oh, I should have taken a note of which number it was so that I could refer you back to it.
Oh, yep. Okay. Okay, so that, I'll be quick on that. That one was really where due to a lot of different factors in the Victorian system, you just didn't have the level of coal-fired generation available that theoretically you could have had. So effectively that 30% means that of the total number of theoretically available coal-fired generation that in Victoria, you only had 70% of it actually available for dispatch.
Right, so, okay. Yep, great. No, that's, it does. That answers that question well, thank you.
The 250 above it, that's 250. Yeah, so that's basically what you're having. What's happening in Victoria is you're getting not enough capacity in the system. You're getting it, and then you're having customers being cut off, basically to be able to actually close the gap between supply and demand.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. We've got you touched on hydrogen in your last answer, and we've got another question. Would a gas pipeline, say with hydrogen going to the mainland to a gas power station, would that be potentially cheaper than HVDC?
Well, there already is a gas pipeline that runs between Victoria and Tasmania. At the moment, it actually transmits gas south. Look, it's a really interesting point. I think that the technology, there is the possibility of mixing hydrogen with natural gas in existing gas assets. Gas isn't my field of expertise. I'll point that out. But I think that to be able, I think you'll find that that would be a relatively small opportunity with respect to the size of the opportunity we're talking about here. So, particularly as with the economics of hydrogen, it's still an emerging industry. It's a different set of economics to what you see in the electricity market. So, look, I think at the moment you'd have to say that there's quite a big gap between the economics of doing something like that in terms of building a gas pipeline purely for hydrogen, as opposed to investing in an HVDC, and particularly when HVDC is becoming globally, it's becoming very much seen as an integral part of most power systems, particularly as power systems become more reliant on that dispersed new generation. HVDC, especially long distance HVDC, and undersea HVDC is just a different variant of it. Is becoming more and more important, and you're seeing a lot more interest across all energy markets globally in terms of its role.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. Another question here, do the deep storage solutions that we're discussing today, do they provide synchronous generation, so supporting voltage and things like that?
Yep, they do. Yeah, so they do. And it is important to note that the ability to provide those sorts of services in a pumped hydro Tasmanian context is different to what then can be provided over the interconnector, because interestingly, it's the interconnector technology that's important from a Victorian perspective in terms of what services it can transfer. But once again, the HVDC technology is quite astounding in terms of some of the services it can now provide into a market. It certainly can't provide things like inertia, but it can provide a lot of other ancillary services into markets. So, and that's all picked up in the Marinus Link, assessment. But certainly, within Tasmania, there's the opportunity to use those assets for those sorts of ancillary services as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Chris. I've actually got about 20 questions that have come through. Which,
I can see them keep coming through, so I'll keep trying to answer them quickly.
Yeah. I thought I'd mention that, and I'll say let's just do a couple of these quick fire.
Yep.
Next one, how many hydropower plants are there in Tasmania at the moment?
About 28. We have lots. We have lots of smaller sites, and they're quite widely dispersed over the state. So it's a very different system to Snowy. We have it's probably the easiest way to do it, but and about 2,400 megawatts in total.
Okay, great. No, that's a good figure to have to hand. Another question, how long will it take to develop the project?
So really, Marinus at the moment is looking for a commissioning sometime in the mid to late 2020s. And we obviously then, in terms of pumped hydro development, we would line up to their schedule. So effectively, what they're looking at, that timing is really based not just around the ability to deliver the project, but it's also around when the market is most likely going to need access to that new source of dispatchable capacity. And really, from the mid to late 2020s is really the key sort of area of time that they're looking at. So they are big projects and they're long lead times, but I think you'll find with all the interconnector investments across the market, they'll have similar sorts of timelines. And if you look at the coal-fired generator sort of retirement schedule, that's where things really start to get a bit uncertain. In the late 2020s and the early 2030s, that's when we're really not quite sure when they're going to be retiring.
Yeah, and some interesting times ahead there for sure. Another question that's come through: do you foresee local manufacturing capacity being used to supply these deep storage batteries?
Yeah, so I won't comment too much on local manufacturing capacity for chemical batteries. There's probably others that can talk to that. Look, I'm sure that it's going to be interesting to see how the global battery industry really takes off over the next 10 or 15 years. Pumped hydro development, it's a bit different. It's a hydropower construction project, so you're effectively building a tunnel and building an underground power station. And once you've built it, it's got a very, very long life. So for us to build a pumped hydro site to come in the late 2020s, it would be a significant amount of work in Tasmania over the 2020s, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Question here, which is probably a little bit more of a comment, but I'll try and frame it as a question for you.
Sure.
So lots of discussion about lowest cost. And this, the person that submitted this question had said, you know, I'd actually pay more for a sustainable energy solution because, you know, care about the planet, interested in the triple bottom line. The person has said Battery of the Nation and Marinus can make a very powerful point in this respect. Is that how you sort of envision this project, as being something that can contribute to not just meeting the demands that we're going to need over a little while, but also being able to do so in a way that is clean and potentially more affordable?
Oh, definitely, Laura. I mean, if you look at the vision statement for Hydro Tasmania, we are all about, you know, we are 100% committed to a sustainable future. All that we do, you know, not just in terms of our hydropower system, but the wind development we've done in the past as an organisation. You know, we're all about a long-term sustainable future. And so our starting point is always, if you believe that that is the future and that is where we're going, what we need to prove to the market is that the Tasmanian solution or the contribution from Tasmania is economically a very sensible thing to do. And really that's what the point that we're trying to make into the market at the moment is, on the basis that you sign up to this low emissions future, we believe that the Tasmanian contribution can be quite significant, and it's, from a cost perspective, one of the best solutions that we think you're going to see in the market of the future.
Absolutely. In the interest of keeping to time, I think we might have to wrap it up here.
Yeah, lots of questions we'll never get to there, Laura. Yeah,
which I would have loved to have gotten to. What we might do is, Chris, I will, at the end of today, I will forward these questions on to you, and if you are able to get back to our question askers, we would really appreciate it, but certainly understand demands on your time are a bit difficult at the moment. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your presentation today. Really appreciate it. Packed full of information. Lots for us all to consider in terms of the role that Tasmania can play in terms of our energy market going forward. And really exciting news, I think last month when we heard the Prime Minister say that Marinus Link has been sort of designated a project of high priority. So hopefully that spells more good news for you and your team down there in Tassie.
Yes, let's hope so. And thanks, Laura, for the invite.
No, thank you again for coming along. Really appreciated it.